Chapter 2. Heavy thuds, a wild stamping of boots, and a hoarse yell suddenly broke forth in the shadowy alley. Pat and Sam tumbled to the sagging door in time to meet Ezra, who was about to barge in a rough urgency in his manner. "What in time is going on here?" he threw at them. "I missed you and was hurrying back when some tough birds piled into me." "Why didn't you grab 'em?" Sam cut him off roughly. Ezra's swift scorn withered him. "Reckon they're wishing I had," he growled shortly. "I punched back instead." "Skip it." Pat pushed out for a quick look. "Did you get which way they went, Ezra?" "They went that way." The big man pointed towards the open range. "Ain't nothing out there but brush and the backs of buildings." "Well, come on." Stephen set off rapidly. "They won't be hard to spot with everyone in town watching that shed burn." There was sufficient light from a low riding moon to shadow forth the backs of the cabins and shod shanties on this side of the street, and they set off running. "Duck through and watch that street side," Pat tossed at Sam. Sloane disappeared between two gloomy, wrapped structures, and his maneuver paid off a moment later. "There's some hombre now dodging for the brush," Ezra whipped out. He and Pat sprang forward, separated as the dusky figure melted into the sage, and they smashed through the brush, determined to make a capture. It was like trying to run down a jackrabbit. The fugitive held the advantage in the silvery light, and he was making the best of it, dodging this way and that. At last they cornered him against a pass of sage that was too thick to break through. Breath whistling, the man strove to desperately leap over, and Ezra made a flying tackle and grappled his legs, and down they came in a heap, the brush cracking. The big redhead found himself with his hands full. The man under him struggled and thrashed about with the ferocity of a bobcat. Circling the brush swiftly, Pat managed to reach them. His iron hand clasped onto the captive, and with a yank he hauled the fellow up. "Okay, Ez," he grunted. Sam reached the spot, puffing as they faced the man they'd caught. Almost as tall as Ezra and broad-shouldered, with a sullen lantern-jaw face, he appeared a common enough type of range rider. "What's the idea of jumping me and fogging after me this way?" he blustered, glowering at them. "What's the idea of busting into our shack when you thought we were watching the fire?" Sam countered curtly. "What was you after?" "Huh?" The fella put on a look of bewilderment. "Mister, I don't even know where your shack is, if you even got one." With a growl, Ezra drew back a ham-like fist. "Maybe I can help you remember," he suggested grimly. Pat stayed him with a gesture. "Take it easy. All we're after is information," he told the man. "What were you hunting for at our place?" "I wasn't at your place, Stevens," the other denied positively. "But I can promise plenty of trouble if you don't lay off." If Pat noticed this slip of the tongue, he failed to mention the fact. "What I'm trying to get at is, who knew we were coming this way?" He drove on patiently. "I don't know what you're talking about," their captive insisted, obviously determined to not be drawn out. "Well, let me operate on him," Ezra begged. "He'll be remembering things that happened before he was even born." "No." Pat's refusal appealed reluctant, but final. "There's some things about this that I don't yet understand, but no real damage was done." He glanced significantly at Sam. "Have you lost anything?" Sloane was gratefully conscious of the money belt, which had not been removed from his midriff since they had left Powder Valley. He shook his head. "In that case, we'll just turn him loose. This time." "What about them hombres that was with him?" protested Ezra. Pat again looked inquiringly at Sam. "You didn't see any others out there on the street, did you?" Sloane shook a curt negative. Nary a glimpse. What do you mean? Barked the stranger quickly. I wasn't with nobody till you hazed me out into the brush here. Pat made a sign to Ezra, disdaining any retort. He knew this kind, nothing was to be drawn from a man by violence, and Ezra knew it too. The big fella had whipped a belt about the other's wrists behind his back. Reluctant to free him, he made a long job of removing the bond. At last it was done, and the man rubbed his wrists, scowling. Get! Ezra jerked out. The man hurried away towards Quanmoro's night-shrouded street, muttering to himself. Standing there, the three looked after him. Was he one of them? Ezra voiced his doubt at last. Course he was, Sam snorted. No question at all. Then damn it all, the big one-eyed giant began wrathfully. Quit it. Pat shut them off. That fella was one of the gang, all right, but so what? We couldn't have gotten anything out of the lot. As matters stands, they haven't got anywhere, and we've been warned. Well, that's all true, but they was laying for you, Stevens, Sam pointed out. They knew just who you was. That polecat even used your name. First time it was ever mentioned in this town, and the big question is, who knew that you're coming this way with money on you? Pat shook his head. He'd been asking himself that question. The only one I can think of is Chip Connor, he said slowly. They stared at him. You don't mean that drifting cowpoke that worked for you a couple seasons back? Sam asked. Pat nodded. It was Chip who wrote me about this bargain he got into. The Anvil Ranch in the San Pedro country. I told him to watch it close, and finally he wired me to come ahead, but Connor wouldn't play crooked with me. I don't think he would anyway, he added thoughtfully. Maybe he's been talking, Ezra put in shortly. Pat's look said that it didn't jibe with what he remembered about Connor. For the 2 years or so Chip had ridden for the lazy mare. But one thing emerged clearly from their further discussion. After such an introduction to the Arizona range as the night adventure had afforded them, Pat could only look forward to a naughty situation for facing him at his destination. It made him the more anxious to reach the ranch he was considering buying without any loss of time. According to Connor, this Anvil Ranch spread, it lays in the hills above the San Pedro River on the Guerrero side, he amplified. El Castro seems to be a cow town in the valley, and today is the 18th, and Chip named the 20th. We'll be there to meet him. The shed, which perhaps had been fired for the purpose of luring them from their quarters, had burned out by the time they returned to the scene. Quamaro, aroused briefly by the unusual excitement, had returned sleepily to bed. The trio found their shack pretty much wrecked after the battle which had occurred there, but Sam, he spread his blankets on the floor, and the remainder of the night passed through peacefully. If Pat anticipated any renewal of hostilities when they showed themselves the following morning, his demeanor didn't reveal it. But Ezra and Sam had a sharp scrutiny of every man in sight till they had put Quamaro behind them. On this day they dropped down to the desert levels, crossing the Salts and the San Carlos, and reaching the copper mining town of Bonanza Belt late. It was at this point that the San Pedros, flowing north almost from the Mexican border, entered the Gila. Pat said that they would reach El Castro easily the next day. It was all unfamiliar territory to their high country eyes, and riding up the valley in the morning, they studied the ghastly rim rocks and the long barren rock fang slants and the green columns of giant cactuses and coppery sky. Cripes, a cow critter would die of thirst here if he didn't starve, Ezra said sourly. Pat indicated the Guerrero Heights, above and beyond the forbidding rocks. There's pine country up there, good grazing in the canyons, too. You'll see. At our Parvo wash, a brown flood had debouched from the canyon gates, pouring into the shallow, rock-bedded San Pedros, and Sam's jaw dropped as he watched. "Where'd all that water come from?" he demanded, mystified. Pat gestured upwards. "Storm in the hills last night, I expect. We saw clouds over that way. The wash will be dry again in a couple hours." Splashing through, they reached El Castro midway of the mesquite-strewn valley in mid-morning. It was a town of moderate size, mostly of frame construction. Ore freights pulled through on the Benson Trail, and there was a boarding house and more livery and bars than the usual cow town afforded. A sizable Mexican population lent color and variety. "Connors must be in town today," Pat observed as they put up their horses. "This is the day he said he'd meet me here." They had a drink and looked the place over without running into the puncher or anyone else they knew. A leisurely day was spent in keeping a casual watch on El Castro's activity, but without result. Chip Connor did not appear, nor did he send word of any kind. Finally, Pat accosted a steward, a mustached individual whose floppy vest and all but concealed the star pinned on his shirt. "You the sheriff?" The other nodded, slitting lazy, speculative eyes. "Dane Hardwick's the name." Pat introduced himself and his companions. "I rode down from Colorado, Sheriff, to meet a man here today. Chip Connor. He rides for an outfit in the hills." Hardwick nodded again. "Yeah, I know Connor. Are you telling me he's expecting to be here and ain't showed?" "Well, that seems to be the size of it. Of course, we didn't set any time, and something may be holding Chip up. It crossed my mind to wonder if he might have run into trouble of some kind." Dane Hardwick shook a spare negative, without any other indication of his deliberate thoughts. "None that I know of," he allowed dryly. "Connor comes to town occasionally, but Chad Hanlon isn't an easy man to work for." Hanlon. The manner in which Hardwick expressed himself said much. Pat weighed the name. "He owns the Anvil outfit, I take it?" The sheriff agreed. "Well, as it happens, it's the Anvil that I've come here to see," Pat proceeded, with an unusual frankness for him. "Place isn't sold yet, is it?" Hardwick's bushy white brows lifted. "The Anvil's up for sale? First I've heard of it, Stevens." "Well, I understand it is," Pat assured him quietly. There must be some mistake." The lawman sounded positive. "I know Hanlon better'n Connor, and Chad ain't figuring to leave, but his place is where you'll find Connor if he ain't quit." They talked a few minutes longer before Hardwick turned away. The lawman could add nothing to what he had already said, and Sam watched his departure grumpily. "He ain't interested in whether we find Connor or not," he observed dourly. "No reason for him to lie. Don't look so good for friend Connor, though." "How so?" Pat queried. "Well, did he lie to you or what? Hardwick says the Anvil ain't on the block. Why ain't Connor here to straighten it out or explain it?" "Yeah, and what does this look like after what happened in Quamaro?" Ezra seconded heartily. Pat scratched his head in sober thought, canting his Stetson forward. His strong, wind-rutted face was cheerful in repose. "I know what you're both thinking. The Chip coaxed me out here with a roll and then set some ugly pugs upon me." His grin was rueful. "It does look kind of phony with him failing to show up on schedule." He had grown polite. "May I point out to you that Chip said he'd meet me here on the 20th, and it is still, after all, the 20th. The partners exchanged glances of barely masked disgust. Hard to convince, Sam commented. Not headed as a pine chunk, Ezra concurred solemnly. Pat chuckled. Well, boys, do you reckon a drink would improve your rotten dispositions? He inquired with a sugary satire. They retired to the Golden Girl, and an hour later found them still there. Ezra did not even glance towards the poker table in the corner, an unusual circumstance for him. And after supper they loitered at the boarding-house porch, watching the big 6 and the 8-hitch freight rigs pull up, on their way up or down the valley, according to whether they were loaded or light. 9 o'clock came, and still Chip Connor had put in no appearance. Well, Ezra growled, you ready to sell out now? Pat sat forward with a decisive air. Sulphur Springs Valley is a fair day's ride south and east of here. We can make a date to meet there 3 or 4 days from now, or are you two driving the way back east of the mountains? Sam gaped at him, mouth slightly ajar. What do you mean, Stevens? You trying to get rid of us now? He barked crustily. Why, no. Pat's tone was smooth. So long as you break down and admit I'm still capable of doing my own thinking. Then what happened to Connor if you're so darn smart? Ezra flared at him. Pat shrugged. I don't know, he admitted with unexpected calm. Well, what do you do then? Sam pressed. You going out to that spread? His tone said that he found the prospect idle. Well, after coming this distance, certainly. Pat's grin was serene. I'm not buying from Sheriff Hardwick. Let's give this Chad Hanlon party a chance to speak for himself, shall we? They knew he was right. It left them a little flustered after their own show of heat. Maybe you won't want no part of this anvil outfit after you see it anyway, Ezra could not forbear saying despairingly. They hung around till a late hour to give Connor every chance to put in his appearance at the last minute. It was useless. Pat was the only good-humored one of the three when they last sought out their beds. They had secured a room together. What are you stewing about? Pat twiddled as he pulled his blanket over him. We might have run into those hombres we tangled with in Camaro. That didn't happen. Well, maybe they're waiting for us, was all Ezra retorted, turning his hulking back. Nothing disturbed them throughout the night. After sharing a silent breakfast, they walked toward the livery barn for their horses. You two sure you don't want to go on about your own business? Pat asked pleasantly, saddling up. No, we don't, growled Ezra flatly. Something mighty queer about this ranch deal. We're going along. Keep me out of trouble as usual, I suppose, huh? Pat laughed. As a matter of fact, the shoe was on the other foot. For all their stubborn pretense of protection, he frequently found it necessary to haul the pair bodily out of some jam or another. Strangely enough, Pat did not seriously resent the circumstances, secretly enjoying the game as much as they did. For all their crochets, they were exceedingly capable men. No more was said on the subject as they rode south up the valley. It was a famous road that they were following. Spanish conquistadors had ridden this way, seeking the riches of Cibola. Apaches had taken this trail, the bronze desert studded with their strongholds, and the blue-coated cavalry had followed. Blood had flowed in the rocky canyons, and rustlers and thieves had hidden there. Now the broad ruts of the San Pedro Trail were carved deep by the copper freighters, winding out of the loading platforms of the South Pacific main line, yet so vast was this land that all was swallowed up, the lofty ranges etching the sky as lonely and silent as the morning of time. Cougar country, I'd reckon, Sam remarked, indicating the ragged breaks of the Guaralo rim rock. Well, I'll have to ask Hanlon about that. Pat nodded. He might lose a steer now and then to them cats. Further south, the sheer slants fell away, and the long slopes rose to the rolling Winchesters. A freighter pointed out the trail to the anvil, and they toiled up the sandy wash, leaving the brush behind, and entered into the pines. It was only a fringe that edged the tumbling bunch-grass range. "Say," Ezra exclaimed, gazing about. "Not bad country at all. I see some steers over yonder. Lots of 'em, actually." They proved to be Block S stock, and Pat shook his head. "New to me. They're fine-looking cows, though. The anvil must lay north." They reached a branch in the faint trail and then swung left, the wilderness extending in all directions. A measureless prospect. Sam flushed a spooky anvil steer out of a draw. "Well, it can't be far now," he commented. In a little pine scattered hollow against the flank of the mountain, they spied the ranch buildings. There was a frame house of modest size and several log sheds. Corrals occupied much of the open space. "Well, that's a sweet little outfit," Sam conceded grudgingly. They spotted 2 men in the ranch yard, but were not themselves observed, and the trail curved on behind pine scrubs and a little stand of trees, and then soon they were close by. A harsh voice drifted to them in the stillness as they rounded the house. Ezra's craggy brows drew together, and Pat hoisted at what they had heard. "You're no damn good, Nico, and never were," was an arrogant voice blaring. "Work? You never done more than cripple up horses the best day of your life. I got a good mind to crack some of your bones, and by Godfrey, I think I will." There came a sound of scuffling. "But, Senor Chad, burst out the whining plea. Pat thrust past the corner of his house, his lean face tight, to see a husky, thick-shouldered man struggling with the stringy Mexican whom he had grasped with violent hands. Sam and Ezra weren't far behind, their thunderous scowls clearly speak in their minds. The American must have sensed their arrival, catching some faint sound, and suddenly he thrust the old Mexican away from him. "Go on, get out of my sight before I lose all my patience." Nico stumbled away, and Chad Hanlon slapped his hands together, as if ridding them of some contaminant. He turned then, pretending to discover the newcomers with surprise. "Well, visitors, eh?" It was plain that he had expected no one, yet he betrayed no embarrassment. Faint suspicion crept into his hard, handsome face as his eye took in Pat with a sweeping glance, having discounted his companions with even briefer notice. Pat's nod was curt. "That's all right," he drawled. "The handle's Stevens, Hanlon, from Colorado." Hanlon's black eyes widened faintly, and he stiffened. Whatever he might have next to say would never hide the fact that the name had thrown a jolt into him. End of Chapter 2.